Postcard from Hell. I'll start by saying that I'm not crazy. You're going to hear the story and think I've lost it. But I swear to God, every word of what I'm about to tell you is true. It started with the postcard. It was late December, the week before Christmas. I was sitting at my kitchen table, nursing a cup of black coffee, the only light coming from the string of colored bulbs I'd hung in the window. The house was too big and too quiet without her. It always had been, even after 5 years. I couldn't bring myself to move on. Julie was the love of my life. She still is. The mail arrived around noon. A stack of Christmas cards, mostly from relatives I hadn't spoken to in months. The kind of obligatory holiday greetings that made me feel worse instead of better. But buried between the bright, cheerful envelopes was something strange. Postcard. It was old and yellowed, the edges frayed. The image on the front was of a snowy town square, the kind of generic scene you'd find on a card from 50 years ago. But what caught my attention was the handwriting on the back. It was Julie's. I'd know her looping, elegant script anywhere. The message was simple. David, I miss you. I'll be home for Christmas. Love, Julie. I stared at the card, my hands trembling. My first thought was that it had to be some kind of sick joke. Maybe one of her old friends found a letter she'd written and decided to mess with me. But as I read and reread the words, I knew it wasn't possible. That handwriting, it was hers, exactly the way I remembered it. I flipped the card over again, trying to make sense of it. There was no postmark, no address, no stamp, just her words, written in a hand I hadn't seen in 5 years. I didn't tell anyone about the card. Who could I tell? My brother, who already thought I was stuck in the past. My coworkers, who'd stopped inviting me out months ago. No one would believe me. Hell, I didn't even believe me. But that night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, her words played on a loop in my head. I'll be home for Christmas. The days passed, and I tried to convince myself it was a prank. Or maybe even a delusion. I hadn't been sleeping much lately, and the holidays always dredged up old memories. But as Christmas Eve approached, I started noticing things. The lights on the Christmas tree flickered. Even though they were brand new, I heard faint footsteps in the hall at night, the kind that made the floorboards creak. Once, I thought I smelled her perfume, soft and floral, the scent she used to dab on her wrists every morning. It was faint, just a wisp, but it was enough to stop me in my tracks. And then there were the dreams. In them, Julie was standing at the front door, looking exactly as she had the day she died. Her dark hair fell in loose waves over her shoulders, and her blue eyes sparkled the way they used to when she laughed. She didn't say anything, just stood there, staring at me, but her smile wasn't right. It was too wide, too sharp, like she was trying to mimic an expression she no longer understood. I always woke up drenched in sweat. By Christmas Eve, I was a wreck. I hadn't slept in days, and every shadow in the house seemed to shift when I wasn't looking. I tried to distract myself with old holiday movies, but they only made the silence louder. By the time night fell, I was jumping at every little sound. Then, at exactly midnight, the doorbell rang. My heart stopped. I froze on the couch. My breath caught in my throat. Couldn't be. But as the bell rang again, I felt a cold certainty settle over me. She was here. I stood, my legs trembling beneath me, and walked to the door. The house was silent except for the faint hum of the Christmas lights. My hand hovered over the doorknob, every instinct screaming at me to turn back, to lock the door and pretend I hadn't heard anything. But I opened it, and there she was. Julie stood on the porch, her head tilted to one side, a faint smile playing on her lips. She wore the red coat she'd loved so much, the one I hadn't been able to throw away after the accident. Snow fell softly around her, settling on her hair and shoulders. "David," she said, her voice light and airy, just the way I remembered. "Aren't you going to invite me in?" My throat was dry. "Julie," I whispered. She smiled wider. "Who else would it be?" I stepped back, and she crossed the threshold. her boots leaving no marks on the rug. The air grew colder as she passed me, and the lights on the tree dimmed. "You kept the house the same," she said, running her fingers along the mantel. Her movements were strange, almost robotic, as though she were trying to remember how her body worked. How are you here?" I asked, my voice shaking. She turned to me, her eyes gleaming with something I couldn't place. "You asked me to come back," she said. "Don't you remember?" I didn't, but as she stepped closer, I felt a deep, primal fear settle in my chest. This wasn't Julie. It looked like her, sounded like her, but there was something off, something wrong. "I missed you so much," she said, reaching for my hand. Her skin was ice cold, her grip unnaturally strong. "It's been so lonely." I pulled away, my heart pounding. "You're not real," I said, backing toward the stairs. "You're not her." Her smile faltered, and for a moment, her face twisted into something else, something dark and monstrous. Her eyes burned like embers, and her teeth, they weren't teeth. They were jagged and sharp, like shards of broken glass. "Oh, David," she said, her voice dripping with mockery. "You invited me in, and now, you're mine." The lights on the tree exploded, plunging the room into darkness. I stumbled back, my hands groping for anything I could use as a weapon. She lunged at me, her movements no longer human, her limbs bending and twisting in ways that defied logic. I grabbed the fireplace poker and swung wildly, connected with something solid, and she let out a shriek that rattled the windows. I ran for the stairs, slamming the door to my bedroom and locking it behind me. For hours, I sat there in the dark, clutching the poker, listening to her pacing outside the door. Her voice drifted through the wood, soft and sing-song, promising me things I didn't want to hear. By dawn, the house was silent. I don't know what she was. A demon? A ghost? Something worse? All I know is that I'm never going back to that house. I left everything behind, the furniture, the photos, even the postcard. Let it rot in that cursed place. But sometimes, late at night, I hear the doorbell ring, and I wonder if she's still looking for a way back in. The cursed house. I never wanted to move into that house. It wasn't just the idea of uprooting our lives a week before Christmas, though that was bad enough. It was the house itself. My wife, Julie, fell in love with it the moment we pulled into the driveway. But something about it set my teeth on edge. It stood there at the end of a long, snow-covered cul-de-sac, its gabled roof draped in icicles that glinted in the winter sunlight. The realtor called it charming. I called it creepy. Still, we needed the space, and the price was too good to pass up. That should have been my first clue. Julie was giddy as we unpacked, dragging boxes into the living room where a massive fireplace dominated the wall. Our 8-year-old son, Timmy, was less enthused. He hovered by my side, clutching his favorite stuffed bear, his eyes darting nervously around the room. "What's wrong, buddy?" I asked. "I don't like it here," he whispered. "It feels weird." I ruffled his hair, trying to reassure him. "It's just new. You'll get used to it." I didn't believe my own words. That night, Julie decided we should decorate for Christmas. She pulled out the old box of ornaments, string lights, and tinsel, while I wrestled with the massive artificial tree we'd hauled from the garage. By the time we were done, the living room looked like a scene from a holiday catalog. The tree stood in the corner, its branches heavy with ornaments that sparkled in the firelight, and the lights we'd strung around the room twinkled like stars. But it didn't feel festive. Felt wrong. Timmy refused to help. He sat on the couch, clutching his bear, watching us with wide eyes. At one point, he muttered something under his breath. "What was that?" I asked. He looked at me, his face pale. "The lights are moving." I froze. "What do you mean?" "They're blinking," he said, "but not like they're supposed to. They're talking." Julie laughed it off. "He's just tired," she said, scooping him up and carrying him to bed. It's been a long day, but after she went upstairs, I stayed in the living room, staring at the tree. The lights weren't blinking in any kind of pattern, but there was something unsettling about them. The way they flickered, it felt deliberate, like they were trying to get my attention. I turned them off. The next morning, Julie was furious. "Why did you unplug the lights?" she demanded. "They were acting weird," I said. She rolled her eyes. "They're just lights. David, you're being paranoid." But Timmy wouldn't go near the tree. He stayed upstairs most of the day, and when I checked on him, he was sitting by the window, staring out at the snow. "They're in the house," he said. "Who's in the house?" I asked. He looked at me, his eyes dark and haunted. "The lights." That night, I woke to the sound of footsteps. At first, I thought it was Timmy, but when I checked his room, he was sound asleep, his bear tucked under one arm. Julie was snoring softly beside me, so it wasn't her either. The sound came again, soft, deliberate steps, coming from downstairs. I grabbed the flashlight from my nightstand and crept down the hall. The house was silent except for the faint hum of the furnace. But as I reached the top of the stairs, I saw it. The lights were back on. They glowed faintly, casting strange, shifting patterns on the walls. The tree stood in the corner, its ornaments swaying gently, though there was no breeze. And then I saw the figure. It was standing by the fireplace, its outline barely visible in the dim light. Tall and thin, its limbs too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. The lights seemed to gather around it, their flickering intensifying, casting its shadow across the room. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The figure didn't move, but I felt its gaze, cold and invasive, like icy fingers crawling over my skin. And then it spoke, not with words, but through the lights. They flickered in a rapid, incomprehensible sequence, and yet I understood. A single word burned itself into my mind, echoing in the silence. "Stay." I stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight. When I looked again, the figure was gone, but the lights continued to flicker, their rhythm erratic and unsettling. I unplugged the tree again, my hands trembling, and fled upstairs. The next day, I tried to tell Julie what I'd seen, but she dismissed it. "You're just stressed," she said. "We've been through a lot lately." But Timmy knew. He wouldn't go near the living room, and when I asked him why, he simply said, "They don't like you." The third night was the worst. I woke to Timmy screaming. Julie and I bolted out of bed, racing to his room, but he wasn't there. The bed was empty, the covers thrown aside. And then I heard him. "Daddy!" His voice echoed from downstairs, filled with terror. We ran to the living room. The tree was ablaze with light, brighter than it had any right to be. The ornaments spun wildly, the tinsel shimmering like liquid silver. And there, in front of the fireplace, was Timmy. He was floating. The lights had wrapped around him, coiling like snakes, pulling him toward the tree. His eyes were wide with fear, his arms flailing as he screamed for help. Julie rushed forward, but something stopped her. An invisible force, like a wall of cold air, pushed her back. The figure appeared again, emerging from the shadows, its form more solid this time. It reached for Timmy, its long, spindly fingers wrapping around him. "No!" I shouted, grabbing the fireplace poker. I swung it wildly, the metal slicing through the lights, shattering ornaments and severing the strands. The figure shrieked, a high-pitched, inhuman sound that made my ears ring, and then it was gone. The lights went out, plunging the room into darkness. Timmy fell to the ground, sobbing, and Julie and I rushed to him, holding him tightly. We left the house the next day. I don't know what it was, some kind of spirit, a demon, maybe something older, something tied to the house itself. We didn't stay long enough to find out. I sold the place at a loss, not caring about the money. All I cared about was getting my family away from that cursed house. But sometimes, late at night, I still see the lights, flickering in the darkness, just outside the window. and I wonder if it's still waiting for us to come back. The sleigh ride. It started as a simple idea. Harmless, really. A group of us, 5 friends from college, decided to spend Christmas Eve together. Away from the chaos of family gatherings, we rented a cabin in the mountains, nestled in the dense forests of Vermont, where the snow blanketed the world like an old, comforting quilt. I wish we had stayed in. It was Ellie's idea to go sledding. She always had a knack for turning innocent plans into grand adventures. The hill behind the cabin was steep but manageable, the kind of slope that brought out laughter and the rosy-cheeked joy of winter. We took turns racing down on plastic sleds, screaming like kids. But Ellie, being Ellie, wasn't satisfied. "Come on," she said, her breath visible in the frigid air. "Let's go further up. There's got to be a bigger hill." We hesitated. I remember looking at the forest edge. The way the trees seemed darker than they should have been, their skeletal branches clawing at the twilight sky. But the thrill of the moment and Ellie's infectious enthusiasm won out. We grabbed our sleds and hiked deeper into the woods. That's when we saw it. The sled was old, ancient looking, really. It sat at the top of a slope we hadn't seen before, hidden behind a curtain of evergreens. The wood was splintered, the metal runners rusted, but it looked sturdy enough. More than anything, felt wrong, like it didn't belong there. "It's just a sled," Ellie said with a laugh when I pointed out the eerie vibe it gave off. "You're such a wimp, Jake." The others laughed, but I noticed how their eyes darted toward the sled. Uneasy. Still, no one voiced their concerns. Peer pressure is a hell of a thing. Even at 23, Ellie was the first to sit on it. "Who's coming with me?" she asked, patting the spot behind her. Brian, her boyfriend, didn't hesitate. He climbed on, wrapping his arms around her waist. They looked like a picture-perfect couple, silhouetted against the snow. Then they pushed off. The sled moved faster than it should have, cutting through the snow like a blade. It didn't make sense. The hill wasn't that steep. Ellie and Brian's laughter echoed through the woods, growing fainter as they disappeared from sight. We waited for them to call back, to yell for us to follow, but the silence stretched on. "Maybe they wiped out," Sarah said, though her voice trembled. After a few minutes, we decided to follow. I was next. The sled felt cold, colder than the snow itself, as I gripped the edges. When Mark climbed on behind me, his hands were shaking. The ride was strange. The wind bit at my face, and the forest blurred around us. Felt like we were moving too fast. The sled sliding not just down the hill but deeper into something. The air grew colder, and for a moment, I thought I heard whispers, soft, unintelligible murmurs that seemed to come from the trees. Then the sled stopped. Abruptly, we were at the bottom of the hill, but it wasn't the same forest. The trees were closer together, their branches intertwined like a cage. The snow was darker, tinged with gray, and the sky above was an unnatural shade of black, not the star-filled expanse we'd left behind. Ellie and Brian were nowhere to be seen. "Ellie," I called, my voice swallowed by the oppressive silence. Mark muttered something behind me, his breath hitching. I turned to see him staring at the sled. The runners were no longer rusted. They gleamed, sharp and polished, as if they'd been newly forged. The wood, too, looked fresh, the grain dark and wet, like it had just been carved. And then we saw the tracks. Not footprints, but something heavier, drag marks, leading away from the sled and into the trees. We followed them. What else could we do? The tracks led us to a clearing. Ellie and Brian were there, but they weren't alone. The thing stood in the center of the clearing, hunched over like an animal, though its shape was all wrong. Too tall, too thin, its limbs bending in ways that made my stomach churn. Its head turned toward us, and I swear I saw something glinting in the hollow where its eyes should have been. Ellie was on the ground, unmoving. Brian was standing, his back to us, his body rigid. He was holding something, a rope attached to the sled. The thing stepped closer to him, its movements jerky, unnatural. It reached out with a hand, or what should have been a hand, and placed it on his shoulder. Brian screamed, a sound that will haunt me forever. And then he was gone. The thing yanked him into the darkness, the rope trailing behind. We ran. Sarah tripped, and I had to pull her up. Mark was ahead of us, shouting something I couldn't make out. The trees seemed to close in, the branches clawing at our clothes and faces. The whispers grew louder, a cacophony of voices that filled my head with static. We found the sled again, sitting at the base of the hill. It looked newer now, the wood polished, the runners gleaming. "We have to go back," Mark said, his eyes wild. "We have to go back up." I didn't want to. Every instinct in my body screamed to stay away from the sled. But there was no other way. The forest had turned into a labyrinth, the paths looping back to this one spot. We climbed on, the three of us packed together, and pushed off. The ride back was worse. The whispers turned into screams, the wind tearing at us like icy claws. The world spun, and for a moment, I thought we'd never stop. But then, suddenly, we were back at the top of the original hill, the cabin in the distance. Ellie and Brian didn't come back with us. We tried to tell the police, but they didn't believe us. They found the sled, though, still out there, sitting in the snow, waiting for its next riders. I don't know what it was. A ghost? A demon? Something older? Something worse? All I know is that we weren't the first, and we won't be the last.